the University of Arizona Bio5 Institute, we bring together hundreds of multifaceted experts that include world-class bioscientists, engineers, physicians, and computational researchers. This team science approach is designed to ignite creative solutions to the many complex biological challenges facing our families and communities, and has resulted in disease prevention strategies, promising new therapies, innovative diagnostics and devices, and improved food sustainability.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Science Talks, a conversation hosted by the University of Arizona's Bio5 Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Brittany Uhlorn. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. November is Native American Heritage Month, and we recognize the historical, cultural, and economic contributions of Native Americans in Arizona. We also celebrate the ancestry, traditions, and contributions their communities make today and have made throughout history. It's not only important to celebrate this group, but it's essential that we help to support Native Americans and other underserved populations' health and prosperity through our research efforts. Today, we're joined by Dr. Paloma Beamer, a professor of public health and a research scientist in the Asthma and Airway Disease Research Center. She's also director of the Community Engagement Corps for the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center. Dr. Beamer's research focuses on understanding exposure to environmental contaminants and the associated health risks, with a special focus on vulnerable populations in our area, including Native Americans, children, low-wage immigrant workers, and those in the U.S.-Mexico border region. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about her research and finding out where her passion stems from. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So for those of our listeners who might be unfamiliar with our work or with your work, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure. So what I am most interested in is understanding how people are exposed to contaminants, and this can be chemicals or even viruses like COVID. Like, what parts of our daily lives bring us into contact with these? Is it in our drinking water? Is it in the air we breathe? Is it in the consumer products we choose to buy and bring into our homes? And then can I use my background in engineering to come up with interventions to reduce those exposures? And I came to this from engineering because I was really struggling to understand, how do we develop these interventions without knowing where the main exposures are occurring. And so if you think about in the last year, the pandemic, we were so focused on droplets and surfaces, when in reality in our field, we knew that airborne was always the predominant exposure route. And now that we've shifted that paradigm, it kind of changes how we deal with things. And in particular, what has always interested me is understanding these exposures in communities that have been less served and that experience a disproportionate burden of these exposures.
Most definitely. You're right. We have learned a lot about COVID and how it's transmitted over the past pretty much 2 years now. So it's interesting that you're able to have, your research kind of spans a large number of contaminants, like you said, whether it's more of a chemical thing in the air or it's a virus. And I know you just mentioned you're interested in the disproportionate effect on underserved populations. So why is your focus there? And what kind of makes their exposures or experiences unique?
Well, I think if I were to go back and look at my own life, it comes from growing up binational and bicultural between Mexico and the US, and really looking at my grandmother's homes because they were so different from one another. One lived in suburban California and the other lived in Mexico in a cinder block home with a corrugated roof and biomass cooking stoves. And I could tell from a very young age how different those exposures were and how that impacted health. And then growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, seeing that different regions of the Bay Area were really impacted by the environment in different ways, really stimulated my interest in understanding how could I help serve or work in those communities that may not have as much access to the resources they need to protect themselves and to explain things in different culturally relevant ways, so that people could understand how to protect themselves. And over the years, I've learned that how we're exposed really differs based upon some of our social cultural practices. So what type of drinking water we choose to drink. Some groups might drink their tap water, other groups might not, for a number of reasons. But if we treat everybody as the same, we're not understanding how they are actually being exposed to things. So
Right.
we can reduce those exposures.
I think that's really interesting what you said. It made me think of, how we have when we talk more about medicine, we have this one size fits all mentality that's not right. The one drug is not going to cure every patient with the same disease. And so I think it's interesting how you kind of take that mentality to what you're doing with environmental exposure, and how each group, whether depending on their socioeconomic background, can be different, both with their exposure and in terms of interventions. I know you were talking about how you kind of have to tailor your messaging to the group you're talking to. So can you speak a bit to that and why that's important, and how you approach talking to different groups and about their exposures and their risks and how they can protect themselves?
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that I think I've really learned over the last few years is that you really need to understand the community you're working with, and every community is different. And this varies from some rural, predominantly white communities that I worked with in Arizona to some of the Native American communities, or some of the ones that I've worked with along the US-Mexico border. And with each community, I mean, the first step when we're working with them on an environmental health problem is to sit down and think, what is the concern? Why is that a concern? And then how are you exposed to these contaminants? What are all the different, and sometimes we just start with sketching. What are all the different pathways, and how can this happen? And in particular, with the Gold King mine spill and my work on that, on the Navajo Nation, we identified a lot of pathways that may not have occurred to more conventional researchers at the beginning, that were really important to the community and how they interact with the river. And in the end, we ended up doing an assessment where we ran focus groups and kept asking questions about, well, how do you use the river? How do you use the plants along the river? And we found 42 different activities where people were using either the water, the sediment from the river, or plants or animals that grew along the river in a way that they could be exposed to contaminants that were in the river and that hadn't been incorporated when EPA originally did their risk assessment when they reopened the river.
Yeah, so I know you just published these findings back in February, right? Just recently.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a bit. I know, at the end of the abstract for this paper, you talk about how when identifying all of these different unique activities between is it the Dene? Is that how you say that?
Right. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the San Juan River, you were hoping that your findings were going to change how both scientists and disaster responders respond to environmental disasters. So how do you think your findings can kind of change the way we assess what's going on, and then also help these groups moving forward?
Right. So the first step, like if you're looking at a risk assessment to determine if something is potentially hazardous to the health, is to identify all the ways people are exposed and to look at how much and the frequency and the intensity of that. We do this every day, right? With COVID, when we go, oh, am I going to a crowded place? Is it indoors versus outdoors? Are people wearing masks? Who's going to be vaccinated? It's the same idea, except here we were looking at lead and arsenic in a river. But what we published in that paper was just the activities and how often people did them before and after the spill. And we did show a huge decline in their interactions with the river, which has much bigger implications than I think most of us can understand for what it is like for an Indigenous community to not be able to pass on some of their traditional practices due to fear of contamination. That's a priceless shift in their way of life that maybe not something that they can recover from to maintain those cultural practices. But we also used those, those estimates of how often they were using the river in different ways to come up with a risk assessment of what their potential risk to their health was from lead and arsenic. And these papers are still being finalized, so that's why they haven't been published yet. But we did show that although the risk was still low, even after the spill, and with the even if they had resumed their original activities, their risk would still be low. It was 10 to the 9, so almost 1 billion times higher than what was estimated originally at the time of the spill without incorporating those activities. So it does show how important it is. We were fortunate in this scenario that it didn't make the difference between saying it's risky or not risky, although it really is not a black-white issue, but kind of the continuum.
Right.
But if there was higher levels at the original spill or something else that happened, not incorporating the Dene way of life into the risk assessment may not have been protective enough for certain communities. And so that's, for us, what we hope, building forward a framework moving forward. One of the things that was, I haven't had a chance to talk about this much, but we spent a week collecting the samples and those questionnaires up on Navajo Nation. And I came home that weekend and turned around and went to DC. And I was serving on a panel for the US Environmental Protection Agency on their guidelines for exposure assessment. And it was the first time those guidelines had been updated since 1991.
Wow.
So, I mean, this is where we are at. So I'm the past president of International Society of Exposure Science. That society was started in 1991. So it gives you an idea of perhaps how outdated those guidelines were. And there was a whole chapter devoted to how do you do exposure assessment with Native American communities. And I forgot to mention that I was one of the youngest people on that review panel.
Wow.
I was one of the few women, I think there was only 3, maybe out of 10, one of the only people of color on the review panel, and the only person from west of the Mississippi. So this gives you an idea sometimes of how it's like to be in these rooms and at these tables. And the consensus of the panel was that you didn't need to have a special chapter for Native Americans because exposure isn't related to your culture. And it was really eye-opening, but also at the same time, having just spent a week on Navajo Nation, of how different, how important that was to take into account, to be able to take that experience and speak at this table, and how important it is as we move forward with policy to take this into account so that we can protect these communities. Indigenous communities have a much closer relationship with nature and are much more impacted by a lot of environmental contaminants than many of us can ever imagine.
I'm sure it's wonderful that you were able to bring that perspective and kind of that, firsthand experience working with those Indigenous communities, because it sounds like, the people that you were working with didn't really understand the importance or the impact that exposure has on these communities. So I'm curious then, now that you've updated the guidelines, how is handling these situations? How is handling exposure and risk assessment different with Native Americans? Is it solely that cultural perspective? And if so, how do you go about navigating those challenges that are kind of different from when you're talking about any other group?
Well, let me emphasize that it was EPA that updated the guidelines, and they had added that chapter, and our job was as peer reviewers to give feedback on their updates, and that chapter did stay in there. So there is quite a lot of guidance now for people that want to conduct risk assessment with Native American communities. One of the other things that has really shifted in the past couple of years is the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, which is one of the NIH institutes, but dedicated to environmental health. Along with the UNITE initiative, which is NIH-wide, has really begun a focus on addressing structural racism. And so there is a huge focus within that institute to make sure that we are conducting research that supports communities and helps minimize the impacts of environmental health on them while being culturally responsive to them. So that's been an exciting shift to witness. And serving on study section, I'm seeing a real shift in that.
I'm sure changes like that are a long time coming, but I'm glad that they are definitely starting to happen, because that's important to have those different perspectives and respond in different ways. So. So I kind of also want to talk about your role with the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center. So you recently became the Community Engagement Corps Director, and I know that Corps has a long history of working with tribes. So can you tell us a little bit about the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center and what you do as Community Engagement Corps Director?
Sure. So I have a couple hats within the center too, so I'll talk to a couple of them. But the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center is a core center funded by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. And it's really to help, bring together researchers here at U of A and close by institutions to work on environmental health issues, along the translational research framework, which goes all the way from, bench science at the cellular level, all the way through policy change, and trying to think about how we can all work together to address those. So within the center, I also run the Human Population Exposure Resource, and that's a core function that tries to get researchers engaged more in environmental health studies with humans and measuring exposure, and to help, I guess, reduce the potential energy to get somebody launched into doing a study that would be community engaged. And so we can help with everything from human subjects protocols to subcontracts to how to design a study that, will help you get the right questions answered, how to give the results back to the community, all those sorts of things. And we work really closely with the Community Engagement Core, which now I also direct. And the idea behind being in both those roles is to bring together both perspectives that we're addressing the concerns the community has about environmental health. We're also letting them know findings from the center researchers, that they can use to protect their environmental health. We are working on ways of how can we improve communication about environmental health? How can we, and so we're doing research on that, but how can we communicate risks better? How can we address risk perceptions people might have about, for example, something as simple as tap water versus bottled water, and what that means for their health. And then ultimately, we're working towards sustainability. We know that here in Arizona, as well as across the US, that certain communities are impacted a lot more by environmental health, but the people that grew up in those communities are less represented in science and as scientists. And so we're working a lot on training the next generation so that we can build sustainability. And we operated 5 summer programs this year, from middle school all the way through tribal community college students. So that's an exciting aspect as well of the work that we do. So traditionally, that Community Engagement Core has partnered primarily with tribes, and we have several ongoing projects, but we're now expanding our work to also include Latinx communities and rural communities in Arizona, which also experience health disparities.
That's neat. It sounds like quite the multifaceted role you have. I'm curious about these summer programs. Are you bringing in the students and the children? Are you bringing them to the university, or are you going out to their communities to educate them?
So this last summer, they all came to campus, and not all of them are residential. We did have a few residential programs, but they all come. And the real big push for that is that we really want to give them a sense of belonging on campus. We want them to feel like they belong before they enroll at the U of A. Because as we know, for underrepresented students, that's one of the most important facets for success. So we do make sure that they come to campus, they get to meet the faculty, they get to interact more, and feel comfortable here and can see themselves here in the future.
Yeah, that is important. I'm glad you're able to provide them with that opportunity and start to cultivate that sense of belonging to make them want to apply. And I'm sure that also helps them to succeed when they finally do get accepted and step foot on campus as, a University of Arizona student. I'm sure that helps them to just grow into that role even more. So I'm curious, I know you talked about the many different roles you have at the health sciences, the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center. I'm curious what parts of this role you find to be most challenging.
Well, I think one of the things, and it's both within my role in College of Public Health too, is when you're really involved in community engagement, and especially under the conditions we've been working on for the last, I would say in my world, the last 5 years, ever since the Gold King mine spill happened. We just barely got over dealing with that disaster, and then COVID hit, which is a big part of the work we do right now in public health, is that you're constantly dealing with unexpected fires every day. And trying to maintain good relationships as you navigate your way through them. So making sure that you're responsive, that you are addressing community concerns, that you are fostering those partnerships, that you're building upon them. One of the things that I would say is, because of how closely we've worked with multiple partners for so long, that we are able to address things like the pandemic faster, or know who to go to, or how to get the resources to different communities that need them when we do get approached with questions. But I would say it's just the the rapidness with which things can change every day. And again, trying to make sure that we can do authentic partnerships with our community partners, and navigating that through the administrative structures of the university takes a lot of our time as well.
I'm sure. Yeah, I know it could be. I'm sure it's challenging too. You know, we have this unpredictability of nature of what things are going to be pressing and what we could be exposed to, whether it's the next virus or the next, you know, airborne contaminant. So it's great that you all have this existing infrastructure in place and these connections built so that, you know, when the next thing does hit us, you're able to draw on those connections to respond. So I'm sure that's a big help.
And actually, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences did a mock disaster here. I don't know if you were aware of that back
No.
in February 2019, so just a year before the pandemic hit.
Oh, wow. No, I'm not.
Both through the College of Public Health and through the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center, we helped run that mock disaster. It was a multiple day event. It was a national conference hosted here, and that really helped us. We already had a lot of those partnerships, but it really helped us solidify those partnerships. So I think it really did increase our responsivity.
Most definitely. Yeah, I'm sure that helped. So I know we touched on this at the beginning of our conversation, and you've kind of alluded to it throughout, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, you are a professor of 3 very different disciplines. So your main appointment is in public health, but you also have backgrounds in engineering and working with Indigenous communities. So I know this multidisciplinary approach really aligns well with, you know, what we're all about here at Bio5. So if you could tell the listeners how your interdisciplinary background really benefit your research.
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt really at home at Bio5 since I do cross so many of the disciplines. I did my my PhD and my master's and bachelor's all in engineering. And so that's why I have maintained an engineering appointment, but I have also collaborated with the engineering faculty for many years. But when I came here to U of A and first started off in public health, I also recognized that I needed to have more training in clinical and translational research and in epidemiology, that those were areas that I did not have sufficient training. And I was really fortunate at that time to get a Career Development Award from NIH and to partner with the Respiratory Center, or the Asthma and Airway Disease Research Center, as it's known now, to get that training in those areas. And that has allowed me to develop a lot of skill sets, including GIS and working, you know, with large data sets, as well as how to interpret findings from them. That has really let me come to this point where now I can kind of sit at this nexus of all those areas and work with junior investigators that are interested in learning those areas to kind of increase the number of multidisciplinary studies we can do on these topics here in Arizona.
Yeah, I think having that multidisciplinary approach is so important, not just to what you're studying, but really to anything in STEM. I think we're seeing, you know, we've been seeing for the past few years that it's not enough to just be an expert in one field. You really have to take into account multiple, you know, overlapping areas of expertise and bring in different collaborators. And like you were saying, train the next generation in this approach to really advance what we know and, you know, help all the communities that we can with our research. So that's great that you're able to use your background and then get this additional training and also pay it forward to those that you're able to mentor.
And one of the things I would say about that time when I was able to work on the Career Development Award was that I really took the time to learn these other disciplines, not because I'm going to become a biostatistician or I'm going to become a chemist, but so that I can you know, work with my collaborators and understand their data sets. Because ultimately, when we come back to understanding exposure and how people interact with their environment, we have to understand how the chemistry is being conducted, how the statistical analysis is being performed. It really requires us critiquing and being able to look at it analytically. Are we really addressing the question that we care about? And we always need, you know, social science approaches as well, because we are trying to address behavioral change that in a culturally competent way.
Yeah. So are you collaborating with a number of researchers here at U of A or at other institutions?
Yeah, I have quite several projects that are here at U of A across departments, both within the College of Public Health and across campus with several community groups as well. But we also have several projects, like we just started a new one funded by EPA to look at how much soil and dust children ingest, and that's with the University of Miami and North Carolina A&T. So we're working to look at how that changes across the country.
Interesting. Yeah, I was about to ask you what some of your next projects were, but you were saying you have this study about dust exposure in children.
It's a little bit, sounds a little esoteric and a little bit maybe boring. Like, does it really matter how much dust children ingest? But when you think about how do we regulate pesticides? How do we determine how clean is clean enough for a hazardous waste site? How do we figure out, how much flame retardant can be in our sofa? For example, all these things that we interact with every day, one of the most important parameters to estimate that exposure is soil and dust ingestion. And it's one of the ones that has always been labeled as one of the most uncertain ones in all of we call them exposure factors. EPA has a manual. And so it's exciting that there was finally funding available to apply for to work on this. And this is actually an area of research that I started off in my master's. So it's coming back to something that I have worked on for a long time. And I have gotten to work even with other countries. I worked in Taiwan on some of their estimates, and the collaborator at North Carolina is a colleague from grad school. So it's exciting to come back together and to work on using the new technology to estimate some of these factors.
Yeah, it's really
recognizing how important it is for policy and for protecting children's health in the future.
Right. Yeah. It really does sound like it's coming full circle for you.
And
you're
I have
right.
a 3-year-old, so I see it every day.
How old?
I have a 3-year-old and an 11-year-old, but the 3-year-old definitely highlights how important this route of exposure is.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's really nice when your own research can kind of hit home like that. So then will the results of studies like this, you were saying you would hope that they would impact policy or kind of, how things are regulated? Is that the goal of this work?
That's the goal. So EPA usually only funds studies that will impact how they make decisions or regulatory guidance. And so that's why this has been kind of a more difficult area of research to get funded, because it's not as related to novel scientific discoveries as a lot of the NIH kind of research is, but it's very practical and necessary information that's needed if you're going to estimate how much pesticides can be applied to apples, so that if the parents use it on their lawn, the kids aren't overexposed.
Right. Yeah, that is important, and especially to protect the little ones, because they are our future. So it's so important to have this kind of research to inform, like you said, how much we can be using, and how much exposure is too much, so that they can stay healthy. So very important.
Also exposed at a much higher rate per body weight than adults.
Oh, really?
And their bodies are still developing, their brains are still developing, their lungs are still developing. And so any kind of interference can actually have much longer lasting effects.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Well, thank you for joining me today. I have really enjoyed our conversation, and learning about your research and how you combine all these different disciplines, and then of course how you have this culturally centered approach to the work that you do with Indigenous communities. So I really appreciate everything you've shared with us today, and I know our listeners will too.
Thank you too for having me.
Of course. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of Science Talks. So for more information about the Bio5 Institute, please visit our website at bio5.org. And you can listen to more Science Talks episodes wherever you find your podcasts, as well as our videos on the Bio5 Institute YouTube channel. So from all of us at the Bio5 Institute, we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of Science Talks. Continue the conversation with us next time as we learn more about the amazing science happening at the University of Arizona's Bio5 Institute.